who have sophisticated roles in the business world who happen to be libertarian, they cite the confusion and chaos that sometimes occurs because our board serves as volunteers with and sometimes underneath staff. We have board members who are engaged in day-to-day operations of the party by heading, standing, and ad hoc.
In the last 30 years, I've probably worked with more than 1,000 nonprofits, and every one of them has that model, where board members are volunteers, and every one of them has the model of sometimes they take direction from staff in execution of their volunteer role. It's a matter of switching hats. When you're in the boardroom, it's about policy and strategy. When you're working in your committee, it's probably more about helping staff with strategy, and maybe even tactical, depending on your skill set and the organization's needs. But that is pretty much the model of most nonprofits, unless they are super, 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 super large, like major universities, where the role is more of an institutional role. But show up at a governing meeting, talk about some things, vote on some things, and then you're done.
And to that end, Debbie, you know, I'm on the board of the Greater Key West Chamber of Commerce. That's how we met. And the way that organization runs,
major universities where the role
to move away. I've heard it framed as the strong chair versus the soft chair model, or you know, strong versus weak chair model of an organization. And it seems the suggestion here is really the chair responsibility is to be sort of a liaison between the board and staff. And the board creates a collective vision where the executive director and staff ultimately carries out that vision, which creates consistency over the long term. So regardless of the next board is, at least the staff has that mission, and one person's not going to completely change that vision. So it's more about the board's collective goals. The chair would facilitate the conversation of what are those goals. Staff carries out those goals. Kind of like how, you know, a lot of cities work. We have a municipal model where the city manager is sort of in charge, but you know, the board just kind of does more administration. So is that? Could you elaborate on that a little more?
We should do more like government. Is that what you're saying?
So there will be times when board members on the committee roll up their sleeves and go out and volunteer to do some research or volunteer to, you know, whatever the tactical thing may be. But they're doing that in the space and under the direction of staff. So I'll give you an example. I've just been working with a national organization that decided to offer investment and banking opportunities to all of its state affiliates. And some of the board members did some of the research, but they did it under the direction of the staff CEO, who was coordinating the work product of all of them to get a consistent deliverable. So there are times when you are taking direction from staff at a committee level, but if you had a consistent, common, collective vision and an annual work plan, your budget would be built around that, and your executive director would be held accountable for executing to that. Then I'm going to say she, because Hannah is a she, as your current leader. She's driving with the committee chairs the agendas and the work product of the committees. So she's actually working with the committee chairs to say, okay, the board expects us to deliver A, B, and C. How often are we meeting? How are we breaking these tasks down? Does that help, Stephen?
Sure. Yeah, I think so.
I don't like the label strong chair or weak chair just because I think they're pejorative.
I agree.
A better label for me, if I have to use a label, would be effective chair. In today's world, an effective chair is a facilitator, and you know, oversees the CEO executive director based on the collective vision of the board, not that person's individual vision.
Ms. Harlow?
Things. I know some may disagree, but you know, as a parliamentary organization, actually the LNC is a parent organization to affiliates. You know, some people might not like that terminology, but I think it is in fact a fact. Also, just as an FYI to you, our executive director did bring this up the other day. That spreadsheet that had been made available didn't update fundraising totals, and there actually were 6 LNC members that had at that point raised money, but since that time, last night, more LNC members had raised money.
Congratulations, that's wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Harlow, that's great to hear.
But Mr. Dar is still the superstar.
For now. For now. Mr. Martin?
Thank you. I just wanted to touch back on some of the that you're talking about on the board. There's some difficulty in achieving this just because of the nature of our organization. And then there's also a huge problem with trust, as you pointed out. And I can say with very strong certainty that there are at least half the people in our organization feel like the rug got pulled out from under them this year. And they're worried that all the things that we voted for are not happening. And then this board, instead of prioritizing making those things happening, we're prioritizing purging the board and eliminating behaviors that we don't like without the trust or the consensus that people would trust these decisions are actually good. We have one of the most disrespectful and embarrassing members proposing these behavioral rules. I'm sorry, not proposing, but advancing and advocating for them aggressively. Pardon me, I was mistaken.
Let's not disparage the board members.
It's not disparaging any particular board member. It's just saying that there is a lack of credibility to, I mean, I'm here on the board. I want to believe that they mean well, and I want to adopt some serious standards that would help improve the way that we appear in public. The problem is that what I'm looking at looks like a weaponized attempt to try to seize and maintain control by a small cabal of people, and not a good faith attempt to implement PDR. That was kind of goes back to my earlier question.
Too sober for this.
So the question is, how would you approach it? How would you approach it if you wanted to give us advice on how to do this with credibility without breaching trust with our constituents? What's the best way? Because what I'm seeing alarms me. I'm seeing enforced loyalty and the removal of members very easily for having dissenting opinions, which happens to be some of our jobs. We have to be able to communicate with our constituents. We get elected by having opinions about what this board does. And now we're seeing kind of an idea on how to, improve our image, mainly by, censoring board members' ability to disagree with the board. And I realize the problem is more complex than that, but like just as an example, how would you recommend that we proceed to be able to implement these suggestions without tearing our ship apart?
Board members should vehemently disagree in the boardroom. That's the place for it. But when you walk out of the boardroom, your board has made a collective decision. And there's a lot in the expectations of the role of a board member, which you were not at the session last summer when I did that. But the role of a board member has, by the IRS's definitions, provides for the duty of care, the duty of loyalty. And their definition of that is have feverish debate, come to decisions in the boardroom, and walk out with a collective voice. Do not sow dissension. If your position wasn't the winning position, it sows dissension when you're talking about something that's already been voted on and trying to change the outcome. Once you voted on something, you have a decision. And it's the responsibility of board members, it's the fiduciary responsibility of board members to put the organization's needs above their own.
And what if we disagree on those needs? That's the thing. Like, what if I have a different opinion about that? And again, if somebody wants to run against me and say, hey, I do a better job at this job because I disagree with the board's bad decisions about X, Y, and Z. And so do I. I fought against them hard, but I can't even talk about it because that would sow dissension. I'm not a guy who sows dissension. I'm not one of those who does that. And you can tell by just the way these people react to these comments that, there's not a lot of respect for the will of the constituents that put us here. And so they're going to continue to be angry. And basically what I'm hearing is you're advocating for a top-down approach where national basically clamps down on the states and ignores their will and imposes its will on them. And I see this splitting our party. If it's not, well, we have to keep trust.
I think this characterization, I think what this space is talking about is the board.
I'm not saying that national should impose its will on states. I did not say that. I talked about board member decorum and was considered one of the 3 duties as outlined by the IRS. That's why I'm urging you to find the areas of commonality. Find those. Focus on those. But there are going to be some times when organizations make decisions that some states won't like.
Sure.
And they're going to be the outlier. That is what it is for every national organization. It doesn't mean the national organization takes its path over where it needs to deliver the majority.
And it also means that the board makes a collective decision on an issue that we vote on. We don't go on Twitter, X, Facebook, media, whatever, go to our friends, and say, I disagree with the board's decision. You don't see one of the board members of Coca-Cola going, you know what, I disagree with the board. Because that would be unprofessional and bad for the business, right? So.
And actually, for most organizations, done repeatedly is grounds for removal because it violates the very tenets that the IRS sets up as the duties of board members.
Ms. Scavenge, then Mr. Chatterton, Thompson, Robbins. Ms. Scavenge.
Yes, hi Debbie, it's Kathy Scavenge. I'm wondering if you could give us some advice on how to work on board dysfunction and I'm not sure if you know this or not, but 2 days after Hannah emailed us your report that said it was a confidential review, it was on Twitter. Somebody from this board leaked the report and put specifically information about this from the staff section about staff and morale verbatim on Twitter. So can you give us some advice on how we should address board mistrust and dysfunction when things like that happen?
When something says confidential on it, board members have a responsibility to keep it confidential. The business materials that are labeled confidential are meant only for the board's eyes. If you have to put that in writing to explain it to people, maybe you need to do that because that is not an acceptable behavior at all. Ever.
Just pass a law.
And if that happened in a business situation, that person would be removed and maybe even sued.
Mr. Chapman.
Along the same lines, I think, of trying to build a credible and trusting board. I appreciate the things that you mentioned about, trying to adopt, standard behavior, codes of conduct and such. I'm curious to hear if this is potentially a strong pathway, is that when we considered this policy adoption yesterday, there were several, I think, reasonable concerns raised about the implementation of the policy being a little too blunt, needing a little bit further work, and all that. The folks that dissented to this policy raised those, I think, fairly, and it was pushed to our next meeting to be considered at that time with some further adoptions. Would you consider it to be an effective kind of means to build that trusting board relationship and working relationship on the time of that matter being delayed until next meeting, that one of the chief people pushing that policy proceeded then to verbally attack other board members and make insults, and then defend that behavior by making the comment, "Oh, we didn't adopt the policy yet, so it doesn't matter." Is that an effective way of kind of working towards building that
Well said.
trusting board relationship?
You have to have adults in the room.
That was also mentioned by the same individual, ironically.
There is never, ever a reason to insult someone. We all have the intelligent ability to articulate our opinions without insulting people. Why can't we bring that behavior to the board?
What would be the appropriate way to handle a board member who has repeatedly violated those standards of behavior over many months and basically their entire time on the board? After repeated warnings and slaps on the wrist, who continues to conduct such behaviors on a regular basis? What would be the appropriate way to handle that?
Foxbury.
It's sort of like having to handle the bully as a schoolyard. At some point, you have to call it out, and maybe you have to call it out every time and say, "This is not appropriate. This is not appropriate. This is not appropriate." And at some point, if that individual just lacks self-control to that degree, maybe you need to have a conversation around, this isn't working for the board. You're actually being disruptive. It would be in your best interest and our best interest for you to resign. And
Adrian, it's not working out, man. It would be in our best interest to
Order,
move this.
Can we point of order?
My apologies.
Mr. Thompson, that was some impressive meta commentary with the last two questions. Layers upon layers. So I'm sorry. You mentioned earlier about it may have been Chair Taylor, about you wouldn't see a board member of Coca-Cola going out and then challenging a decision the board made. And that makes sense. And I definitely think we have problems with people inappropriately raising objections outside of meetings, right? But as a political entity, and a lot of the board members being representatives for their constituents, I would submit that a political organization is slightly different in that regard, and maybe not for the best, but you might not see that with Coca-Cola, but you would see that with Democrats and Republicans, and elected members of Congress, things like that, right? Now, I would hope that we wind up doing better than Congress, perhaps, but as an example of a political entity, right, that should be getting along, you wouldn't want a congressperson removed because they challenge the way a vote went, right, after the fact, because they still want to represent a certain viewpoint, which is why they were put in place.
But I will say you have worked on a lot of political campaigns. You remember part of your loyalty is expected, and there are things you can speak out against, and then there are things that you can't open your mouth about.
Are there things
And that's
aside from
political reality. But I want to separate what you do around political positions from what you do in a board room. And governing is different than political races. When you come to a board room, you have on a board path for a party to govern. Right?
right? But
And that is different. So, and I'm not suggesting you shouldn't debate, you should, absolutely.
right,
And
but then we
and
should
you
contain it.
have
to
the
be-
opportunity to go back to your state or your region and say, look, we debated this intensely, and there were more people that found commonality in a different position. We can still have our position. I, as a national board member, am not gonna be negative nationally to the governing body that made that decision.
I agree on many cases with that, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how much you dug through our dirty laundry. But, yeah, we had issues where we were fundraising for our political opponents. It was an ongoing breach, right? It was voted on. I was on the losing side of that, but I also feel that it was still healthy to voice dissent after the fact, because it was an ongoing breach, at least from my perspective. And, when there are things like ongoing allegations of embezzlement, things like that, some, which would be better handled privately, but it's also not something that I feel that we should threaten removal of someone because they disagree.
You bring up a really good point, and what I'm gonna say is, it's not that you disagree. It's the way and where and how it's
I can
communicated.
agree with that.
Disagreement is healthy. Disagreement is what makes organizations stronger when it is functionally healthy. And that's the difference. Somehow, your group, as a collective group, has lost the boundaries of healthy debate. And what
That's not
happens
accurate.
after healthy debate for organizations, when people are board members, if you're Joe Random in the field, you can criticize all you want. But if you're a member of a board, you've taken on a legal governing responsibility that your first loyalty is to that governing board that you sit on. That is the definition of the responsibility expected of board members. I didn't make that up.
Ms. Rose and Mr. Vaughn.
I did take notes though, Mr. Nicola. First of all, I want to express my condolences that you're dealing with a bunch of libertarians who are allergic to the word collective. Every time you say that, I see everybody twitch. I think that what some of the concerns are that perhaps you can address. First of all, with the leak of the confidential report, that was a warrant. We have no idea who did it, so there's no way to take any action on that. I think some of the concerns haven't used this word, but I think what they're getting at is maybe I slightly disagree with your duty on fiduciary, but maybe I don't, because maybe we just haven't treaded to this area. That if a board member thinks a board is violating its bylaws or its purpose, they may believe they have a fiduciary duty to use a more industry term, whistleblow about it. And we don't have adequate whistleblower protections, I think, is what some people are getting at. Also, our constituents ask us, why did you vote no? Our constituents ask us, why did you vote no on such a vote? And people are worried that if they explain their no vote, it's seen as undermining the board. And to say that you can only say, go look at the video of the meeting is not going to be sufficient with libertarians. There is a just unique culture that we have, and that's really all I had to say.
As far as, I would say, if something is egregious enough that it needs to fall in the whistleblowing category, then, certainly that policy needs to be strengthened to give people protection to feel comfortable doing that. There's nothing about loyalty that says that you can't, in a one-on-one conversation, position that you took, as outlined is how it's going to be explained in the minutes, right? It's right there in the minutes. It's right there on the video. It's right, you guys make those public facing documents. What I'm suggesting to you is, it's not that you disagree, it's the how and when and where you do it that makes it egregious. So it's one thing to have a quiet conversation with someone to explain your vote when asked. It's another thing to do a rant on a social media platform. The rant is not appropriate. The conversation when you're asked is perfectly appropriate to say, look, I disagree, here's why, I got outvoted. More people, more of the governing board went this way. That's how democracy actually works.
Mr. Boss and then Ms. Scott.
Actually, just said what I was going to say.
Okay.
Yeah, David, to your point, as Travis Boss at large, I was on the ethics committee also. I think one of the impetus wasn't so much the discussion, but the discussion would be fair, factual, and non-disparaging. So that we do appear to have functional disagreements on the public-facing side, whether that's our private, not private, our personal platforms, etc. I agree. You kind of, I guess you kind of said what I was thinking as well.
What I would say is, I wish I could do this for our entire country. We've forgotten how to debate ideas instead of disparage people. We've forgotten how to debate positions based on their merits instead of making things personal. And when we lose our responsibility as human beings to recognize that everybody can have different ideas, and we debate those on the merit of the ideas, we lose decorum. And once you lose decorum, you have to agree on a set of practices for how, look, we know there are dissenting opinions. How can we debate in a healthy way all of those different opinions so that the pros and cons can stand for themselves without the level of emotion that's introduced and without the level of attack that's introduced, because those things erode trust.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. On something besides the decorum thing that it's already voted on. You mentioned earlier that there were some issues, and if you can't speak on this health data side, you mentioned that there were some issues that staff had with board members, with some behaviors and certain requests of staff. Could you speak on that some, or is that too confidential?
I can give you a couple of examples.
Okay.
Staff often gets jumped on, frankly. Board members that are frustrated call them and vent.
I didn't know that was a service they provided.
That is service you provide them is,
They'll bill you by the hour.
no, I was talking to her as the boss.
Hey, Drew, pick up.
In working with you all, sometimes you cross boundaries with them by venting with them about other people, about decisions made on the board. They can't influence an outcome or those things at all. And they have so little time, and they are so dedicated to your organization that it is super discouraging to them to waste a minute of it on negativity like that. And they fervently wish that they would see, in their terms, the board would grow up and behave like adults.
Thank you. Wish the same thing.
I believe we're at the end of time for the report here from you, so thank you very much. I want to respect your time today. Stephen just had to step out, so we'll end the broadcast now, but thank you very much for the
Thank you, Debbie.
report.
Thank you.
I'm let her have this on this. We need you.
Oh, yeah, no further.
We need
So
you
you want to come up, sure.
please, and it has been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Do we need a recess while we recess?
I don't, but Vice Chair Dar,
We do 5 minutes. 5-minute recess? Yeah.
I do have the results of the bylaws election. If you want to announce that first or after the recess.
Let's do after the recess. Limitation. 5-minute recess.
Just an FYI, for alternates, there's a 4-way tie that's going to require a dice roll.
Ew.
Can we just do it right on?
No,